Well, let's begin slowly. And first of all, welcome everyone to another session of Renaissance Lives. Today is the Dutch painter Rembrandt van Rijn, 1606, 1669, and we're discussing Rembrandt's Holland, the title of the book that you can see, with the author Larry Silver from the University of Pennsylvania. Some lives are quite inseparable from the town and country where they took place, and some art historians, and even more, some politicians would even say or claim that it is the greatness of a land that makes great art possible, since one reflects the other. But things are, of course, far more complicated in the case of Holland and actually of other countries whose wealth derive from colonial brutalities. Now, this is one of the many themes which is addressed by Larry's book, Rembrandt's Holland, so that the Dutch Golden Age made Rembrandt possible. But as we know today, one country's golden age is another region iron age. And in this case, the wealth that made possible Rembrandt himself, as much as the subject and the objects that he depicted, was based on Dutch colonial expansion, which included the commerce of spices, of exotic goods, as well as a prospering slave trade. Now, to discuss these matters and much more with Larry, I can't think of any better company than Paul Taylor, who is a curator of the Warburg Institute Photographic Collection, a specialist on Dutch art, but who has also explored many more aspects of world art from Assyria to South America. So, Paul, the first question is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Francois, and welcome everyone, and welcome Larry. Welcome in from Pennsylvania. This is your third book on Rembrandt. You've written another one since. How does it differ from the other sort of books you've done, and what were you trying to do with this book that differs from your other books?
Well, it wasn't even just trying to differ from my other books, but from the whole library that constitutes the publications on Rembrandt. There are many books devoted to his life, to his works of art. What I wanted to try to do in this book, though it also has a small compass and posed special challenges of that kind, was to show how in some ways Rembrandt and what we now call the Netherlands grew up together, because the country achieved essentially de facto independence around the time Rembrandt was born, and achieved de jure independence during the height of his career in the 1640s. So on some level, he was experiencing the rapid growth of Amsterdam, to which he moved from Leiden, as well as all of the things that Francois mentioned briefly, the amazing outreach of the Dutch, particularly through their sea power in both trade and military conquests, and the prosperity that flowed from that. So I wanted to paint a slightly broader picture. Most books that are about Rembrandt are only about Rembrandt. And this one also spends a little bit of time, albeit obliquely, with the people who studied with him, who went on to their own careers and sometimes overshadowed him as time went on.
Well, we'll come back to that overshadowing later on, but Francois has already given us a drawing which isn't in the book. When we were talking about this beforehand, we agreed that it would be nice to see some pictures which you didn't get around to talking about in the book, and ones you like. And I don't know if you want to start off with saying something about this drawing.
Well, we can certainly both chime in on this magnificent drawing. It's a drawing that Rembrandt made with a great deal of care. It's on prepared paper, which is a technique that goes back, it's usually called silver point or metal point. It goes back to the 15th century, often used for portrait studies. And this is a portrait of his betrothed at that point. He married her about a year later, Saskia. Most books about Rembrandt start, or at least focus a great deal, on the self-portraits. And deliberately, I put them toward the end of this book so that they wouldn't overshadow that richer, more connected aspect of his life. But this is a great way to begin, because it shows his extraordinary ability as a young man. At the time he made this, he was a mere 27 years old, we can see not only the care that went into it, but we even see a very rare thing in Rembrandt, which is his signature. Not very legible, I must say, but his signature. And the inscription, I wrote it down so I wouldn't have to try to read it myself. He says, "This is drawn after my fiancée when she was 21 years old, the third day of our betrothal, the 8th of June, 1633. And so in some way, and it is the only absolutely verifiable portrait of his wife, whose identity has been seen in many of the females that he painted while they still lived together before her death, her premature death in 1642. And we see already in this that wonderful combination that Rembrandt has throughout his career, but shows more in his drawings early on, which is the ability to render likeness with amazing fidelity, as well as that extraordinarily sophisticated kind of soft modeling of shadow on her face, but also the kind of seemingly casual and quick rendering of the incidentals of her sleeve and costume, or even of the shadow that she casts off to the right. The detail makes that especially clear. And all of the things that we really come to love about Rembrandt are in this drawing, the kind of focus on the individual and the ability somehow to capture a bit of the mental absorption that his sitters have in front of him. In this case, with the personal stake that he had in recording the woman he would marry and live with for about a decade. So it's
as you know, later on in his career, people sometimes complained about his inability to catch a likeness. And he even had portraits sent back because they looked nothing like the sitter whatsoever. With this one, you can see that one of her nostrils is about a centimeter lower than the other one. He does seem sort of, to sometimes to have struggled to catch a likeness, doesn't he? I mean, he makes these incredibly convincing images that really look like people, but whether this is actually what Saskia looked like is hard to say. And as you say, this is the only absolutely certain image of Saskia we have. And we're trying to identify the other ones on the basis of this, which probably isn't a very good likeness. So no wonder there's so much confusion about the people in his pictures in the 1630s. Yeah?
Well, the other thing is that Rembrandt was already doing things that the conventional and professional portraitists were not doing. They were the ones who tried to simulate what we would probably use a camera for nowadays, to get an absolute likeness that could not be faulted, even down to the smallest bit of lace on the costume that someone wore. Whereas here we can't even exactly identify what she is wearing. And then that makes us begin to wonder, as you were pointing out, about the features of her face. So when we see, especially in this kind of magnification, the kind of scribble that Rembrandt was capable of doing, it does look as if parts of this drawing were tossed off as not being so important. So one begins to realize that some of his sitters might have been impatient, and there are some who actually refuse to pay him. And some of our records of Rembrandt's lifetime wound up being court records of those kinds of disputes.
Well, here's another portrait from the other end of his career. I mean, this is from the 1660s. It's thought to have been painted, in fact, in the last years of his life, probably. I've never seen this picture in the flesh. Have you, Larry?
I have. It's in Braunschweig, which is sort of between Hamburg and Berlin in Germany. There are people who feel that the signature isn't quite right, that it's been added to the picture, which is one of the vexing problems that Rembrandt connoisseurs always have to struggle with. That's a very distinctive R that he put down, but it's much too flowing for a signature, especially at this time of his career. We have no idea who the sitters are. No one has ever succeeded in identifying this family portrait. It's interesting for a whole variety of reasons. It has that amazing range of rose and red and carmine harmonies on the right side. And once again, they look tossed off in comparison to the exquisite refinement of that face. But again, if we were going to try to compare it to something photographic, we begin to notice how much it's quite visibly made with paint and brush. Rembrandt, especially at the end of his career, was perfectly willing to, and some of that may have been a matter of being older, some of it may have been a matter of trying to imitate certain famous Italian models like Titian, who notoriously in his old age got much more lively brushwork, much less fastidious rendering of details. If we look at the hands, for example, we can see that that looks unfinished by the standards that Dutch portraiture had held. And it is likely that compared to some others of this exact moment in Rembrandt's career, that he would not have been the first choice for people who wanted the more meticulous verisimilitude of certain kinds of portraits. But it is actually a very moving image of a family as a family. And that's a tradition that's not so very old, although it goes back to the 16th century. Some of the very first Dutch family portraits were painted in the 1530s, and then the next generation, right after the middle of the 16th century, began to do more of these kinds of pictures. They're not very common in Rembrandt's own century, and this is a real standout in his work. He did certainly group portraits of institutions, of males, like the famous syndics of the Drapers Guild, sometimes called the Dutch Masters, or something we'll see a little bit later, the Militia Guild portraits. But a family portrait is, especially with children and parents all together in this kind of quantity, is pretty rare. This picture also, I mean, you can almost, I think one commentator said, you almost want to keep painting it yourself. It's so energetic and lively. And look at the lower left, that wonderful little girl with the basket, whose face is lost in shadow, and whose face really looks, especially when you get this close to it, as if it's painted in smudges and blotches. That's obviously not unique to Rembrandt. There are other artists. Velázquez sometimes does this, and it's carried on well into the 19th century by the painters who made those kinds of images. Manet, one thinks of. But it's a remarkable balance between this kind of bravura display of his brushwork and the need to get characters and faces and portraits down on the canvas.
So Francois has anticipated us going to the next painting. I mean, I think that we're both kind of intrigued about what the relationship is between this picture and the one we just saw, because the characters in them do look awfully similar. And these two pictures are very big pictures, and they were both painted at around the same time. They're both on canvases which are about 1 centimeter away from one another in size. They're very close to one another in size, and that seems strange. And yet we think of this picture as being a history painting. Well, at least that's how art historians think of it now.
Well, Francois, if you can toggle back to or toggle between, if we look especially at the face of the woman, we can see a remarkable kinship between that face and the face in this, let us call it for the moment, biblical scene. The man resembles the other man, but this chap doesn't have exactly as close a match. And that could be also laid up to the fact that Rembrandt painted young women relatively the same, which is what causes some of that confusion about whether he's painting his wife or he's just painting a generic, attractive young female face, something that comes up in the case of Rubens as well. This is an example, or most people seem to agree that this is an example of how a portrait might have been fused onto a biblical subject, something that occurs with other Dutch painters as well, including some of Rembrandt's own pupils like Ferdinand Bol. We call that a portrait historié, a portrait that is in the guise, or historicized portrait, perhaps is a better translation. Of course, this scene is by no means transparently obvious what it represents, except for a kind of tenderness between a man and a woman. There has been some good research on it, and there is even a vague consensus. Nothing except for that potted plant on the right seems to provide us with a sense of location. The costumes are relatively, they're certainly not contemporary Dutch costumes, but They're not very specific as to place. None of the turbans and some of the Levantine costume that Rembrandt sometimes favors appears here. We certainly see, in terms of when it dates in his development, that here too he has slathered on paint so thickly that it's almost three-dimensional in that man's sleeve, and we just admire the pigment itself, especially here, as we did in the previous family portrait.
I think that one of the things that about Rembrandt's paints, especially this period, is that when you look at them, when you're in front of the paintings themselves, it's often quite difficult to know what exactly you're looking at. It's difficult to understand even what you're seeing. I remember I had this brought out to me in that wonderful show, the Caravaggio Rembrandt show that they had in Amsterdam some while back. And there, you know, Caravaggio's paints are normally fairly matte on the surface. You know where you are with them. And then you look at Rembrandt and suddenly they look like jewels. And you don't quite understand how this thing has been made, or even what you're seeing.
Well, look at the highlights just above the woman's hand that's on the screen now, those bits of white. We have no idea what they refer to, whether there's any kind of specific metallic thread or any other kind of reason for that kind of gleam or glow. Obviously, the pearls come across as very beautifully rendered, but and I suppose the bracelet at her hand or the rings on her fingers. But the costume, we have no idea exactly how it's put together, and it's and one of the things you and I have discussed is the degree to which the hands on the one hand are extraordinarily physical, almost three-dimensional, and at the same time they have a wonderful quality, almost like Cézanne, of dissolving before your eyes as well. When you think you've captured them, you see that especially in the hands of the male, where parts of it are sinews and tendons, and parts of it are just pink paint applied to a surface. As far as the subject of this work is concerned, it's like a number of other Rembrandt images, and again, because of limitations in size, I couldn't by any means show, you know, all of the religious paintings of Rembrandt. But often, and especially toward the end of his career, he seems to have painted subjects that are reduced to just one or two main figures with very little setting to give us any indication of what's at stake. There's a painting, for example, in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg that has been debated. It shows a man heading toward the viewer's space away from a couple of men behind, one of whom wears a crown. And that's always been associated with a biblical subject because of the king. More often than not, it's thought of as a scene from the Book of Esther, but it could be King David. It could be even a third king from the Old Testament. And there's always been that feeling that Rembrandt seemed to be more interested in the interior lives and the human content than in the specifics of telling a narrative with a cast of characters in the old Cecil B. DeMille fashion. This one has been, there is a drawing in a private collection in the United States that shows a couple very much in this kind of a pose being looked down on by a third person at a window above and to the right. We have this picture has never been cut down, so it's not as if such a person disappeared. There also is another bit of evidence that could make this picture slightly more eroticized than it appears now. And that's that X-rays show that originally Rembrandt seems to have wanted to show her on his lap rather than standing beside him. So putting all of those things together, the interpretation emerges that because of the watcher from the window, this is a scene of Isaac and Rebekah from the book of Genesis, and that they are being observed by King Abimelech from a window, who discovers that they are not brother and sister as they claimed, but husband and wife. Yet, in the absence of that from this picture, one could just as easily substitute Abraham and Sarah, who pulled a similar trick when they went to Egypt. They just weren't spied upon, according to the biblical text. So And of course, eliminating the presupposition that it's from Genesis in the first place means that we don't have any specific reason to call this a biblical scene rather than a mythological scene. And we do know, for example, that a couple painted by Jan de Bry posed as Odysseus and Penelope. So there's no easy way to pin this down in any definitive way, although for the most part that Isaac and Rebecca's story seems to have held the field against challenges. But it is an amazing and remarkable picture.
Yeah.
And that leads us to this cluster of works, which I asked Francois to put beside one another. If we look at the picture in the lower left corner, which is a rather small picture, although bigger than you would think, and also not cut down, now in Stockholm, the subject once again is relatively removed from any narrative context, but the print to the right makes it quite clear what the context is, and that the woman who is looking out from the shadows in the painted version is almost certainly the Virgin Mary. The subject here is an interesting one, and again, this whole set of images of a single subject, which is, and in fact, we could multiply this trio with at least 2 or 3 others. I can think of 2 paintings, and I can think of at least 2 etchings that also do this subject. This particular subject comes from early in the book of Luke about the infancy of Christ. It's actually a Jewish ceremony that Rembrandt must have known about, and certainly, obviously, the Gospel of Luke was aware of because it's so much closer to the Jewish aspects of the life of Jesus. In Jewish tradition, the firstborn son is brought into the temple and is essentially redeemed from the obligation to go into the priesthood per se. That's often done now with a small cash payment to a rabbi. But in any case, this presentation in the temple is a Jewish ritual. And according to the Gospel of Luke, when it happened, the Christ child winds up in the hands of an aged man named Simeon, who he's a prophet essentially, and he has been waiting his entire life for a sign that the Messiah will come and that he will be able to live long enough to witness him. And then he, in the Latin, it would be nunc dimittis, now let thy servant depart in peace, O Lord, because mine eyes have seen the light for the Gentiles. He also goes on to prophesy that Mary will suffer with a sword in her breast, something that traditional Catholic imagery of the 15th and 16th century sometimes shows quite literally as the sorrows of the Virgin Mary. In this case, too, of course, the mixed feelings of that prophecy, as well as the maternal feelings of a mother. In the etching that's still on the screen, which is in the later manner of Rembrandt, we see how he uses light, something that is a leitmotif, no pun intended, throughout his career, to provide a kind of focus in his pictures, but in this case, a symbolic image in which we see the glimmer of a halo around the head of the Christ child and a light full on in the face of Simeon as he realizes that this baby in his arms is the promised Messiah. We have this wonderful image too, that as Simeon is in the temple before the rabbi and his lieutenant, who's called a sagan, that this ritual has more than the usual significance. But this is the dark manner of Rembrandt's later etchings, which can be compared to the sort of broader manner of his paintings that we see in the Stockholm example.
Can I just ask a question, Larry, about the large figure in the background, which looks like it must be an idol because it's still, it's not a human being clearly. Why would Rembrandt think there would be an idol in the temple in Jerusalem?
No, that's not an idol. That's the Sagan, who is a sort of secondary rabbi.
But he's enormously big, no?
Oh, indeed, indeed. And well, if we go to the upper left etching of the same subject, and if you can go in on that a little more, Francois, What Rembrandt begins to do, it's less significant in that later dark etching as it is in this much more narrative work from early in his career, in the early 1630s. Rembrandt shows the scene with Simeon in his arms and the kneeling Virgin Mary, and then a whole host of onlookers, some of them dressed in caftans and presumably temple era garments that Rembrandt associates with the Near East. And we also see the dove of the Holy Spirit above this older woman, a widow named Hannah, who is also something of a prophet and witnesses the subject. But importantly, in the lower left corner, which is just emerging here in the detail, if you can zoom back a little bit, Francois, we see something else happening. At a lower level, there is a whole series of similar, very obviously temple-based Jewish figures, as well as a dog scratching himself, who are doing something completely different. And what Rembrandt begins to do in a number of his works, up to the time that he quits making biblical etchings in the late 1650s, is to contrast the world of the temple with the world of the New Testament, to show that the world of what would have been called the law versus the new law or the era of grace under Christianity is a religion that has failed to recognize the presence of the Messiah the way Simeon does. These people are completely oblivious to what's going on in the foreground. And so that figure that you took to be an idol is in some ways a representative of this corner scene, that is to say the Old Testament world of the Jewish temple, which ultimately will be destroyed not long after Christ's own crucifixion, but also which does not, in the view of Rembrandt in some of these pictures, which represents a kind of antipode or contrast, or a religion that will be superseded by the younger true faith of Christianity.
Can we just look once again, Rembrandt? Francois, at the print in the top right, on the right. Yeah, I mean that figure in the background is about sort of twice as tall as Simeon. I mean,
right, he's frightening. He really, I mean, it is a very striking and ominously frightening image, and I think it represents, in some ways, a slight softening of the contrast that Rembrandt drew in that earlier etching, but also a kind of reminder that this is still a world of ritual and of, from a Protestant point of view, of legalities and obligations and the old law, rather than the freer world that, especially in the Pauline epistles, is contrasted with the new faith. That's something that you were asking about other books. I co-authored a book with Shelley Perlove in which we talk a great deal about that supersessionist model of the Protestants. But one of the things that one should say in terms of the issue of Rembrandt and the Jews is that I think Rembrandt is aware of the teachings, especially of the Dutch Reformed Church following the institutions by John Calvin, that for the Jews, as the original covenant with God and the chosen people of the Old Testament, there was already what Calvin called a partial revelation, and that the Jews were given a kind of initial selection, which then was transmitted or transferred to the younger faith through the figure of Jesus. Faith is a very important aspect of Rembrandt's religious pictures, and we saw that in the face of Simeon in the picture that we just looked at, but it's very important in this subject too, which also comes from the Gospel of Luke. Toward the end, I think it's Luke 24. This is Jesus after the resurrection, so he is on some level transfigured in his visible essence into something that is more revelatory of his divine nature. And here at the very beginning of his career, while he's still in Leiden on the left, in a very small picture in Paris in the Jacques-Marandré Museum, we see this scene. I haven't identified it yet, but we see a man who is utterly startled to behold now the silhouetted face of Christ, where the light in the kind of Caravaggio-like hidden candle trick or hidden light source trick makes that silhouette by immersing the background in this radiance that presumably is given off by Christ himself rather than a simple candle. And that is the moment of revelation that is taking place. A revelation that does not occur to the lesser light in the left corner, where we see a woman with an ordinary fire doing some kind of cooking chore in the kitchen. What's almost impossible to see in this picture, and just at the very bottom of the screen here, is that there's a second figure, and he's kneeling at Christ's feet. So what we have is two different responses to this moment of recognition. When, and the story, let me back up and give the story. The story is the pilgrimage to Emmaus. Jesus is walking along and he meets two fellow sojourners or hikers, I suppose, to this country inn, not too far from Jerusalem. They're not expressly given names, but we assume that they're on some level disciples, but they don't recognize Jesus because they have no reason to think that he has been resurrected, that he's risen from the grave. And they go in and they break bread. And at the moment that they break bread, these two followers suddenly realize who this is, because Jesus has broken bread with them, and they have a flash of recognition like the flash of a light bulb. One of them in response kneels at his feet, and one of them lifts his hands in surprise and in true awe. This drama
ask
of
a
the
question,
life.
Larry?
Yeah.
In the left, in the bottom left of the earlier Jacquemart painting,
Right.
like a chair has fallen over. What
That's
exactly is going on there?
That's because of the suddenness with which this disciple has recognized Jesus and leapt from his chair to go onto his knees, and the chair has toppled over. I guess that's the simplest explanation.
And while we're talking about bottom lefts, why is there a dog gnawing a bone in the Supper of Emmaus, do you think, or just Rembrandt having fun?
Yeah, well, he had a dog scratching in the presentation in the temple, etching too. So he does like dogs in the corner, sometimes, as Auden would put it, doing doggy things. But you were talking about Caravaggio earlier. Look how much Caravaggio Rembrandt has picked up in this picture in terms of especially the contrasting forms of light and the drama of the silhouette, which is even stronger than what Caravaggio ever gives. And this comes to the Netherlands by means of several Dutch artists who went to Rome. I think most of them got there shortly after Caravaggio had died, but at a time when his art was still very much on the front burner. And they saw the use of light, the simplification of the number of figures, the dramatic interactions. And Rembrandt, even in his earliest phase here, is already giving us that same kind of drama.
I think in the picture on the right, one of the things that charms me most is the waiter coming in with that plate of steaming food. If that is steam rising off, and I can't quite work it out. That's meant to be steam rising up from the food, is it? Or
That's good. Yeah, it probably is. Probably is.
Or is it something on the back wall? I'm not entirely sure.
Well, there you go. I mean, this is one of the problems with Rembrandt from time to time when you get too close. But look how much more subdued this picture is. Even though we have dramatic reactions from two apostles, the drama is a good deal less overt and a good deal less physical and more internal. The one on the left clasps his hands together in reverence. The one on the right is still reacting in a semi-physical way as he turns slightly and looks like he's startled in his chair. And here, that brilliant light of the earlier moment is it's still a visible halo, which indicates that this is the moment of Christ's revelation of who he is. But and again, think about a halo in Dutch art. We think of Dutch art as being so naturalistic. Rembrandt still wants to convey the divine nature of Christ without kind of overdoing it. The other thing that's interesting about this picture, there was an exhibition about a dozen years ago in Paris around this picture, which is dated 1648, and which also is sort of at the center point of Rembrandt's own career. And alongside it, there was a whole series of studies. I show one of them in the book, the one from Berlin. There are 8 or 9 images of just the head of Christ, as if it was a portrait, rather than, and it's a study head, something Dutch artists frequently use. They called them tronies. They're often inserted into later pictures. And these heads of Christ are very similar to not only this painting, which I did not show, but also to the celebrated 100 guilder print, which I did show, also with a very small halo like this, and from about the same moment in the late 1640s. So Rembrandt, if you want to draw a nice trajectory, which never quite works for any artist, but he does move from this kind of physically active and dramatic world to a more subdued, more thoughtful, more internalized set of reactions and emotional responses in the subject. And by the way, of course, here, the waiter, if we want to call him that, the servant, seems to have no clue what's going on, even as the 2 disciples are reacting. But it's a very good example of the same subject content that Rembrandt had addressed already with the Simeon presentation in the temple, where on some level it's the internalization of faith and the recognition of the significance of Jesus that is at stake in these works. And so Rembrandt does make Christianity as a faith into just that, a faith, an internalized belief system. And that's very Protestant too, in a way. It's not the intervention of a priesthood, though we know that Rembrandt's mother came from a Catholic background. Rembrandt himself seems to have followed a much more Calvinist Protestant line of religion, though we can't pin him down on that at all.
Well, Larry, as you know, there's a big trajectory to Rembrandt's career, at least, in that he goes up and then he comes down. You know, this is his triumphant moment. This portrait we're looking at now, the Night Watch. Right. You know, the biggest painting he ever made, and he gets given this picture. He gets this commission, and he does it very well. But then, for some reason, his career starts, cooling down after that. He starts getting far fewer portrait commissions, and there's always been a story in which he's the heroic victim. He's too radical an artist, and people start turning against him because he's not conformist enough. And then, of course, he goes bankrupt and he starts losing commissions and so on and so forth.
Well, imagine if you were one of the sitters for this militia portrait, and some man over on the right with the millstone collar stuck his hand across your face. You might not exactly feel that you've been portrayed as you had contributed to the overall cost of the picture.
This is true. Actually, the picture got badly cut down at one point too. So, Francois, if you could give us the next image, then we can see how it was cut. There you are. There's a reconstructed image of the Night Watch of how it looked before it was cut down. Now you can see that there are 2 more people on the left, right. And you can also see what's happening. They're crossing on the opposite bank of a canal, and then they're coming over the bridge across the canal. So it makes more sense.
The bridge works much more effectively when you restore that piece. Apparently, this picture, because it was so large, when it was moved out of the original quite barn-like or aircraft hangar-like building in which it was housed into the Amsterdam City Hall, it had to be cut down because there was no wall big enough to hang it. But one of the things that I was reading in preparation for today talks about how Rembrandt almost always has an asymmetrical space, and there's a tendency for it to be much more strongly recessive from the left, just as the original restored version makes it look here. And if we go back one, Francois, and we'll see that when you cut that off, at first you don't notice that the picture seems seems a good deal more cramped and crowded, but in fact it is. And we've lost that feeling that the bridge comes right into our space the same way. On the right side, it's virtually identical, and may have been cut down a tiny bit at the top as well.
Yeah.
But
it was cut down a bit. It was cut down on all sides, in fact, but it was mostly on the left. Yeah.
Right. What for me is so amazing about this picture, the individual details are remarkable. But if we can zoom in on the two main figures, and you look at that hand gesture and follow it, you can see the shadow of the hand on the beautiful gold garment of the lieutenant here, Rauderburg. And also, if you look at the almost relief-like embroidery on his remarkable golden costume, you can see a lion, and you can also see the city shield of Amsterdam, which is 3 X's or St. Andrew's crosses with a crown above them. And so not only do we get the hand gesture in shadow, but we find it framing the essentially the symbol of Amsterdam itself. This is a very proud picture of a militia company, a kind of standby National Guard. You notice the gorget or the neck piece of armor that the man on the right is wearing. In fact, so is the man with the lace collar on the left. If you look just under his lace collar, you can see that he has one too. These were men who, well, in our current moment of Ukraine, these we think of citizen soldiers being at the ready. The Dutch, by this time in 1642, were virtually an independent country, but the struggle that they had for independence starting in the 1560s and going into the 17th century was a very active shooting war and siege war against the Spanish, who had formerly ruled the Low Countries. And it was partly a religiously motivated revolt against the imposition of Catholic orthodoxy at all costs, but it was also a reaction against royal tyranny as the Dutch saw it, not so different from, if you'll pardon the expression, Paul, the American Revolution against the King of England. And so the Dutch militia companies, of which this was the musketeers carrying the arms of shooting guns throughout this picture, they were one of several clusters within the city of Amsterdam, led by local patricians who would organize the companies. And so the man in black with the red sash was the captain of this militia company. He's giving the order to march out with his extended hand and his slightly moving lips. And his lieutenant beside him is carrying a ceremonial weapon. I misidentified it in the book, incidentally, as a halberd. It's called a partisan. It's a kind of ceremonial spear, and it's elaborately engraved and carried as another mark of leadership. You'll notice also in the right hand of the captain, whose name is Frans Banning-Kok, that he carries a kind of staff. That baton is his ultimate generalship, if you will, of this militia company. And then we have that wonderful pair. It's actually a pair of little girls, one in blue and one in gold behind, who are essentially little allegories of the company itself, which used a claw as a symbol. And also she's wearing the colors of the insignia of the militia company, which were blue and gold. Francois, if you back up a little, we'll see the banner also, which is also in blue and gold, and marks out this particular company. Yeah, you see, and that of course also was a big status. That he would have been the third ranking member of the company, the man who carried this great flag or banner of the company itself.
Yeah, the banner was also cropped when they cut the painting down, in fact.
Right. Well, as we'll see when we get to the town hall, some of Rembrandt's biggest pictures had rather unhappy fates. The biggest one seemed to have suffered the most.
Yeah. If we could have the next picture, Francois. Yeah, I mean, this got cut down a lot. Of course, everyone at the Warburg knows this because we've got a copy of it that A.B. Warburg made. I've never been quite sure why A.B. Warburg spent so much money on sending somebody to Stockholm to copy this painting, but anyway, it obviously meant a lot to him.
And that's where it is in Stockholm.
They can tell us, what it meant to him later.
Yeah, you've worked this one up. I'm going to let you do a lot of the talking. I'll just chime in with a few little observations, perhaps, as you go along.
Well, I was just putting together slides this morning, and I started thinking, oh well, we ought to have a slide that shows what it looked like originally. So here's what we have is a drawing which was made on the back of a funeral ticket, in fact, by Rembrandt to show what his picture looked like. And then the picture was cut down. And today I found this image at a Dutch newspaper online, and somebody had picked up the painting and dropped it into the drawing to give you some idea of what the picture looks like. Now, the painting was so cut down because this, the large picture was made for the Amsterdam Town Hall, what's now the Royal Palace on the Dam in Amsterdam, and it was a very large a commission with other artists like Jordans and Levens. Here we go. Here are some of the other images which went into the town hall pictures. But Rembrandt's painting was only up in the town hall for a month before it was taken down and replaced with the picture up on the top left now. Now the picture up on the top left now is severely damaged and has been very badly dealt with in conservation. And so you shouldn't suppose that it was originally that brown or that bad, but it replaced Rembrandt's painting. And this has always been something which Rembrandt scholars feel bad about. This is a sort of symptom of Amsterdam turning against Rembrandt. But if we go back one slide, I think we can see what the problem was.
Well, one of the interesting things that differs between what Rembrandt painted and what his minor and obscure student replaced it with is that Rembrandt has the hero of the image facing forward, and like Federico da Montefeltro, he had lost an eye, according to Tacitus.
Well, this is what everyone says, you see. I mean, it's often said, oh, well, this must have been considered indecorous. But I think that if you look at these pictures together, you can see what the problem is. And that is that Rembrandt has completely misjudged the scale.
Right.
His pictures look like midgets compared to the other figures.
Right.
They were all making huge paintings in which they were sort of, filling them up with vast figures. And his figures were about a third as big. So it looks like a conspiracy of pygmies. Surrounded by sort of all these sort of other heroic paintings with huge figures in, and when you start seeing that it just doesn't look like the others in any way, then you can begin to sympathize with people deciding that maybe it wasn't the right picture in the right place.
Well, also the pupil went back to the original drawing designed by Rembrandt's probably most successful pupil, who was given the whole commission originally, but who died in 1660 when all of this was supposed to happen. And the folks who came in and replaced him, for the most part, have their most important figure in the top center, and they have this wonderful rise from other figures up to that climactic individual. And Rembrandt just he sticks a crown on him. You can certainly tell he's the most important figure, but he's, he doesn't have the kind of heroic climactic visual appeal that these others do. And Rembrandt seems to have given most of the, if he would have followed the drawing this literally, he gave most of the space of his painting just to an empty hall.
Yeah, and another thing to say is that in the Royal Palace, these two pictures, which we see on the screen right now, were right next to one another.
Right.
So, the discrepancy between the two, well, you can imagine people laughing actually when they saw these two together, because it kind of looks a bit absurd.
Francois, if you can go back to the supper at Emmaus very quickly, I just want to show that Rembrandt's already been doing that sort of thing. This one on the right. Look how much of this picture also is given over to empty space in more than the top half. And that's what Rembrandt also winds up doing in the town hall. Even though he did seem to realize that it was going to be seen from fairly steeply underneath, and puts a few steps in according to the drawing, it doesn't have anything like that upward movement and kind of power that the other pictures seem to have grasped a good deal more readily.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think necessarily that anyone at the time thought that it was a bad picture.
Right.
They may just have thought, look, you know, it's a nice painting, but it's in the wrong place.
Well, once again, Rembrandt is using that hidden candle trick that he was doing at the very beginning of his career. He hasn't abandoned that. It's actually very effective as a kind of a glow against which these upraised swords of the oath are being sworn. And another thing that people have often noted, although it's hard to know exactly how finished this picture got to be, the degree to which these figures also look broadly painted, some of them unfinished, and quite a few of them look coarse in comparison to what might have been construed as a heroic occasion. It's
Well,
a
if you thought
remarkable
it was going
picture.
to be seen from below, you know, I mean, how high up are they? About 60 feet or something? I mean, a long way up.
Yeah, they are. And, you know, that's maybe one of the reasons why Rembrandt felt he needed to have the figures closer to the bottom so you could see them. But the others seem to have realized that the accessory figures can rise into something much more climactic up above. And Rembrandt didn't get that at all. So there could have been perfectly legitimate aesthetic reasons also for aside from the scale, which is very much to the point, for rejecting it. This is what I believe the literary scholars would say was overdetermined. So poor old Rembrandt. Although good on you for Stockholm for winding up with the picture, and the Warburg too, I must say.
Yeah.
As our hour begins to draw to a close, I wanted to make a point of talking about Rembrandt in the wider world. And I have to say, you know, on some level, there's so much active, thoughtful research being done about Rembrandt always with new questions that we begin now to see, and the Dutch themselves now begin to see much more about their own 17th century history. Some of the most innovative and wide-ranging exhibitions that address Rembrandt have happened since the book came out. It came out in 2018, and 2019 was a big anniversary year for Rembrandt because he died in 1669, and museums are always very fond of big anniversaries. In Oxford, there was a whole exhibition devoted to the early Rembrandt. At the Rembrandt House, there were no fewer than 3 exhibitions, one of which was on Rembrandt's social connections, so a little bit like what I tried to do with the portraits. Another was about Rembrandt's technique, which is not easy to explain in a general book and maybe not absolutely essential for a book on the life of an artist. And a very important exhibition related to this picture called Blacks in Rembrandt's Time, which was followed up the very next year in the Rijksmuseum by an exhibition that didn't have many images, but had a lot of accounts about slavery in the Dutch Republic and the importance of slaves for Dutch colonies, especially the brief colony that they had in Brazil, which they took from the Portuguese and then lost back to them. And that raises this picture as a kind of poster child for that topic. This is a picture relatively late in Rembrandt's career, probably around 1660. We don't know, it doesn't turn up in any of his other paintings as such, that is to say this figure doesn't get inserted, though Rembrandt on several occasions did an image taken from the book of Acts, I think it's chapter 8, called The Baptism of the Eunuch, which is about an Ethiopian, a rather princely Ethiopian, who is, of course, a Black African, and who has his own Black servants. So the class aspects of Blacks and their servitude doesn't come up in the gospel story, but it is relevant to not only to the issue of the Dutch as slavers, but also to the Dutch as missionaries, because there were a number of fairly intensively active missionaries in the Dutch Reformed Church who wanted to spread their gospel to other continents. And In fact, it's a very chilling thing if you've ever been to the Gold Coast in Ghana to visit the slave forts, which the Dutch took over from the Portuguese and then had taken over by the English later on. There's a chapel in one of them after the horrific spaces in which the slaves were confined. If you go up to where the, let's call them the wardens lived, there's a perfectly genial and attractive little chapel with stained glass windows in Dutch about loving your fellow man and such. So the hypocrisy was legion, and it was also very often underscored with religion. But the Dutch are now looking at the Dutch East India Company and West Indies Company, just as the English have done with the various studies of what their international trading companies have done, and the importance of slavery to places like Barbados and Jamaica and the English colonies in the Caribbean for raising sugar in particular, but also other cash crops on which the empire grew rich. So the Dutch are coming to terms with that, and it influences the way we look at Rembrandt as well. But it should be said that Rembrandt also had fascination for so many things and a kind of omnivorous curiosity, which included an interest in costume, as we see in this very beautiful drawing from the Getty Museum of Shah Jahan, who built the Taj Mahal, and his favorite son, Dara Shikoh, who was wound up in a civil war with his brothers to succeed his father. But we see the kind of divine aspects that Rembrandt imposed upon the face of Jesus here given to the divine king. That comes from an original miniature from the albums of the Mughal Empire, which found their way into the Netherlands. And Rembrandt made no fewer than 23 different, you could say, refashionings. They're not quite literal copies. And the originals are in color. Rembrandt did them always in this combination of ink and brush wash. We think some of it was about the costumes and his curiosity about the world of the Indian Ocean that the Dutch were involved in, as well as the British. But he used very expensive paper, which was very hard to get, which usually is called in the literature Japanese paper. It's some kind of a thicker Asian paper for these drawings and for very few others. There are a few prints on Japanese paper as well, but it was almost exclusively reserved for these. So we see the fascination and care that Rembrandt gave. In fact, if we just think back to where we began and that portrait of his betrothed Saskia on the third day of their engagement, and see that some 30 years later, more or less, maybe a little bit less than that, Rembrandt is giving the same kind of attention to these miniatures from thousands of miles away. His attentiveness and his curiosity are remarkable. And in the book, I show, for example, an etching that he made of a shell that could only have come from the South Pacific. It's called a Conus marmoreus. I always call it a Rembrandt shell. I don't own the etching, but I do own the shell. And it's part of a kind of fascination with collecting that Rembrandt also had. The Rembrandt House once had a wonderful exhibition of Rembrandt as a collector. And he had some curving blades from what we now call Indonesia, called krises, in his collection. He had Japanese armor, but he also had prints and drawings from artists all over Europe, including some of his favorites from Italy, Mantegna and Titian and others, as well as the Netherlandish tradition of Lucas van Leyden from the early 16th century. Rembrandt was an omnivore, and if you visit the Rembrandt house today, you can see some of the items that either literally were part of his collection or represent the kinds of things that we know about. Fortunately or unfortunately for historians, Rembrandt went bankrupt in 1656, and they made a full inventory of what he owned in order to essentially to auction it off against his debts. We also know that Rembrandt would make works of art in lieu of payment to some of his creditors, some of whom were very grateful for it and some of whom actually wouldn't accept it and kept trying to sue him for payment. So the biography of Rembrandt can be that tale of decline and ignominious demise. Rembrandt also survived everyone he ever loved, everyone he ever loved, including his son Titus, who predeceased him, and his common law wife, Hendrika Stoffels, who predeceased him, before he did finally die in 1669. But he was a man who was very much interested in the world around him, and who benefited from and engaged with an awful lot of the things that the country that grew up around him was also bringing to Amsterdam.
I think, Larry, on this note, it's time to open the discussion to the audience. And well, thank you both to you, and thank you, Paul. And I invite you to use the raise hand button, which should be towards the bottom of your screen, and then I will ask you to unmute, and then you can ask your question. And perhaps while you're thinking of some question, as I was following your conversation, I was wondering about the various aspects of Rembrandt as a collector, because on the one hand, he might tell himself, well, I will need some exotic things for, let's say, for an adoration of the Magi, for this and that. But another aspect of his collection connects with his self-portrait, where he's doing some kind of role-playing. And I have the impression that he sets himself as an aristocrat who owns a Wunderkammer. So this seems to be a kind of polarity in Rembrandt, picking things up for his painting that he might use, but at the same time surrounding with the wealth that correspond to a status to which he was aspiring.
Certainly, even to be a collector was a privilege, and usually was reserved for nobles or very wealthy non-nobles. And Rembrandt certainly had aspirations. It's interesting in the self-portraits to see, for example, that he gives himself gold chains in a number of them, which was often the kind of a royal gift or noble gift to a favored artist. Rembrandt never enjoyed that kind of status in any of the courts, which is, again, one of the chapters of the book. He never really quite caught on as much as he wanted to with the titular rulers of the Netherlands, the stadtholders of the House of Orange in the Hague, though he aspired to. And in a number of his self-portraits, he either wears gold chains. There's another wonderful one in the Petit Palais in Paris, where there's a poodle at his feet and all of these remarkable garments, and he stands there with a cane, as if he was going to stride out into the street. So he did, and of course, even in the early days in the etchings, he likes doing funny faces or putting on different kinds of costumes. Sometimes he shows himself in a kind of a turban, just as he does imaginary figures in those kinds of costumes. So he does have this kind of ambiguous relationship to aspirations that he didn't fulfill, and a kind of fantasy world for his self-portraits and some of the costumes that he puts on.
Can I just nip in with a quick question, Larry? I mean, we know that Rembrandt got into trouble later in life for not going to church.
Right.
How does that fit with what you take to be his religious beliefs? Or
good question. Well, there's always seemingly a division between the documentary life of Rembrandt and what the pictures show us. The pictures are so full of compassion and interest in religion, and at the same time, he had a common law wife who was hauled in on charges of harlotry because they weren't married. For various reasons, they weren't married, partly his wife's will, but I can't imagine Rembrandt not having a deep and abiding commitment to religion and reading the Bible carefully, whether in Dutch translation or some other. Just as the King James Bible was an authorized translation of the 17th century in Britain, or I guess I should call it England. Well, it wasn't quite Britain yet. So was
King of Scotland too.
Yeah, right. The Dutch States Bible, as it was called, was an authorized translation that came out in 1637. So if he didn't have that as his source before then, he certainly had it afterwards. And Rembrandt continues to make religious art all the way through his career. That Simeon picture on the screen may be one of, if not his very last painting. And he makes prints of religious subjects too.
Yeah, one thing that I once had to do in the photographic collection where I worked was to go through all of our Old Testament folders. And I kept on coming across folders which only had one image in, because only one artist had dealt with that subject, and it was usually Rembrandt.
Right, right. I mean, Gideon's dream, how many people have represented that sort of thing? And or Isaac and Rebecca. And you know, the other artists who did it were artists who were either imitating or had studied with Rembrandt. Very few of the other Dutch artists did that. I should say, in response to the last question too, knowing your way around Amsterdam also means that if you look at Rembrandt's drawings and etchings, you can find the places. There are a couple of rather good books about taking a Rembrandt tour of the outskirts of Amsterdam, going up the Amstel River, going upriver. And that's something I didn't have space to talk about much in the book. But Rembrandt, especially after the death of his wife in the 1640s and early 1650s, spent a great deal of time making sketches outdoors that he turned into formal drawings and accomplished etchings.
What seems extraordinary in this context, and that's really a question for you and Paul, is really how come Rembrandt hardly did any so-called genre painting, interior painting, or can you call some of the portraits like Jan Six, which is someone in an interior, a kind of genre painting, and is it an effect of the skewing of scholarship, the relationship between Rembrandt and genre painting, or perhaps it is his own wish to be seen as a history painting, which in the 17th century is the top of the genres of painting.
Right. I think that's probably the main answer. He didn't do still life much either. And in landscape, he only did painted ones earlier in his career and not later in his career. Those were the kind of specializations of artists who repeated the same kind of imagery again and again. Also, genre painting is usually at the expense of somebody. It's usually to show people behaving badly, old people who are letting young people get away with things and misbehaving themselves, or people in taverns, that sort of thing, who are smoking too much and drinking too much. I mean, that doesn't mean Rembrandt himself didn't indulge in such things. We don't know. But I think most of his art is of a more uplifting kind, in the sense that he's trying to flatter or depict in a favorable guise the people he portrayed, and or he's showing religious subjects, which again had that highest of prestige and kind of historicity of all kinds. You get not only to do subjects from the Bible or from ancient history and mythology, but you also, in doing so, get compared to the other great artists who've preceded you, most locally Rubens before Rembrandt, but also the Italians, particularly.
He did do a number of genre etchings, though, didn't he? I mean, there are various beggars. There's a famous one of a monk making love to a nun. Yeah, I mean, there are genre scenes in the etchings.
Right. No, that's quite true. And drawings as well. Lots of images in the drawings of women and children, for example. Sometimes the children are misbehaving, but only in a kind of whiny way. You're quite right. It is in the field of etchings, although many of those etchings are rather small too. They're not particularly large or grand or ambitious.
Exactly. It seems to be kept out of painting, this universe of the genre that connects with, Van Ostad and this kind of people.
Right.
So, the clock says it's time to close. So on this note, I think it just remains me to thank you very much, Larry, and thank you, Paul, and thank you everyone for your presence and quality question. And we'll meet again in 1 month when we will, in fact, speak about Rubens. So thank you, everyone, and a very good night to you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Francois. Thank you, Larry.
Thank you.
Thank you.